Have you ever looked at an old family photo and realized you were the only one missing? Stay with me until the end, because what I uncovered after disappearing from every family picture destroyed everything I thought I knew about my own life. I was helping my mother clean out the attic when an old photo album slipped from the top shelf and landed at my feet. I smiled as I opened it, expecting memories from my childhood. Instead, I felt my heartbeat stop. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family vacation, every school celebration. I wasn't there. Not because I had missed them. Someone had carefully removed me from every single photograph. My name is Nlanhla Adebayo. I'm 28 years old, and I work as a digital photo restoration specialist in Johannesburg. People bring me damaged photographs every day, trusting me to recover memories they thought were lost. I never imagined the greatest mystery I'd ever restore would be my own family's past. When I asked my mother why I had disappeared from every picture, she burst into tears. But before she could answer, my grandmother quietly whispered, "Because someone wanted you forgotten." That sentence changed my life forever. After everyone went to bed, I quietly slipped the old photo album into my backpack and took it home. I told myself I was only being curious, but deep inside I knew something was terribly wrong. I placed the album on my work desk, switched on the bright restoration lamp I used every day, and slowly turned the pages one by one. The more I looked, the less it felt like an ordinary family album. Every photograph seemed to be hiding a secret that nobody wanted me to discover. Because I worked as a photo restoration specialist, I noticed details that most people would never see. Tiny scratches around people's shoulders, unusual marks in the background, and faded lines where the picture had been carefully retouched caught my attention immediately. In one birthday photo, my father's arm looked as if it had once rested on someone's shoulder. In another Christmas picture, there was an empty space between my mother and grandmother that made no sense at all. It was as if someone had been standing there before disappearing forever. I pulled out my magnifying lens and compared every photograph. My heart pounded harder with each page. The same strange editing appeared again and again. This wasn't one damaged picture. It was every important family memory from my childhood. Whoever had done this had spent years making sure I no longer existed inside our family's history. The most shocking part was realizing when the changes had been made. These photographs were decades old, long before computers and digital editing became common. Someone had actually paid a professional photographer to cut, airbrush, and recreate every picture by hand. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a carefully planned decision. The next morning, I placed the album on the kitchen table and asked my parents one simple question. Why am I missing from every family photo? My mother immediately looked away, while my father quickly closed the album and pushed it toward me. He forced a weak smile and said it was just an old collection of damaged pictures that didn't matter anymore. He told me to stop digging into the past and focus on my future. But their voices carried fear instead of comfort. They weren't surprised by what I had found. They were terrified that I had finally seen it. At that moment, I realized the album wasn't meaningless at all. It was the first piece of a truth my family had been hiding for almost 30 years. The questions refused to leave my mind. My parents had avoided every answer, and the silence inside our home felt heavier than ever. I needed someone who had known my family long before I was old enough to remember anything myself. There was only one person I could think of. Mama Bizisayo Kosa had lived next door for almost 40 years. She had watched me grow up, attended family gatherings, and seemed to remember every small detail about our neighborhood. If anyone knew the truth, it had to be her. When I knocked on her door, she welcomed me with the same warm smile she had given me since I was a little boy. But the smile disappeared the moment I placed one of the altered photographs on her table. She picked it up with trembling hands and stared at it for a long time without saying a single word. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, and I could see that she recognized something I didn't. Finally, she whispered, "This isn't the picture I remember." Those words sent a chill through my body. I leaned closer and asked her what she meant. She gently touched the empty space in the photograph with her finger and said, "You were standing right here. I remember because you refused to smile until your grandfather gave you a piece of candy." Everyone laughed that day. Her voice was quiet but certain. She wasn't guessing. She remembered that moment as if it had happened yesterday. She told me that years ago, after many family celebrations, a man had come to collect the original photographs. Everyone believed he was simply making extra copies for relatives. A few weeks later, the pictures were returned, but nobody paid much attention to them. Looking back now, she realized those returned photographs were different from the originals she had once seen. I asked her why she had never spoken about it before. She lowered her head and sighed deeply. She admitted that strange arguments had filled our house during those years. People stopped visiting each other, whispers replaced laughter, and everyone acted as if something terrible had happened. Whenever anyone asked questions, they were told to mind their own business and forget the past. Before I left, Mama Bizasai reached for my hand and held it tightly. Her voice became serious as she looked into my eyes. Some family secrets are buried because people are ashamed, she said. But others are buried because someone is still protecting a lie. Then she paused for a moment before adding, if you truly want the answers, don't search inside the house. Search where your grandfather kept the things nobody else was allowed to touch. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about Mama Bizasai's final words. My grandfather had passed away years earlier, but his old workshop still stood behind our family home. No one ever used it anymore. It had become a forgotten place filled with dusty tools, broken furniture, and memories that nobody seemed interested in. As I unlocked the old wooden door, a musty smell filled the air. Sunlight pushed through the cracked windows, revealing years of untouched dust. It felt as though time had stopped the day my grandfather was gone. I slowly looked around the workshop, remembering how he used to tell me that every object had a story if you looked closely enough. At first I found nothing unusual. There were old hammers, paint cans, and shelves packed with worn-out boxes. I was about to give up when I noticed one section of the wooden floor looked slightly different from the rest. A few boards were newer, and one of the nails wasn't fully hammered in. My heart began to race. I grabbed a small crowbar hanging on the wall and carefully lifted the loose floorboards. Beneath them was a small metal box covered in dust and rust. It looked like it had been hidden there for many years. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and slowly opened the lid. Inside were dozens of items wrapped in old cloth. The first thing I saw was a stack of undeveloped film negatives stored inside protective sleeves. Underneath them were several handwritten journals tied together with a faded blue ribbon. There were also hospital papers with my name on them, old birth records, family letters, and several photographs that had never been placed inside the photo album. I picked up the first photograph and my breath caught in my throat. There I was, standing beside my parents with the biggest smile on my face during my 5th birthday party. I quickly looked through another picture. I was there again, holding my grandmother's hand at Christmas. Another showed me sitting proudly on my grandfather's shoulders during a family picnic. Every original photograph proved the same thing. I had always been there. I had never disappeared. Someone had removed me later. Tears filled my eyes as I spread the photographs across the old workbench. The empty spaces I had seen in the family album suddenly made perfect sense. These untouched originals showed the complete truth before someone carefully changed every memory. Then I noticed a folded note resting beneath the journals. Written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting were just a few words. If you are reading this, the truth has finally found you. Everything they tried to erase is inside this box. Protect it, because one day your place in this family will depend on it. At that moment I realized I wasn't chasing a mystery anymore. I was holding the evidence that could expose a lie hidden for nearly 3 decades. I carried the metal box into the house and placed everything carefully on the dining table. The original photographs, the hospital papers, the journals, and my grandfather's note were all spread out in front of me. My parents walked into the room and froze the moment they saw them. My father's face turned pale, but it was my mother who could no longer hold back. Her hands began to shake, and tears rolled down her cheeks before she even spoke. She stared at the photographs for several long moments, knowing there was no way to hide the truth anymore. I quietly asked her one question. Why did this happen to me? My voice was calm, but inside I felt completely broken. I had spent my whole life believing I belonged to this family, yet someone had tried to erase me from every memory they shared. My mother slowly sat down and covered her face with her hands. After a long silence, she finally looked at me with eyes full of guilt. She admitted that she had been carrying this secret for almost 30 years. It had haunted her every single day, but fear had stopped her from telling me the truth. She explained that everything started only a few weeks after I was born. My grandfather owned family businesses, valuable land, and several properties. When his health began to decline, arguments over the future inheritance divided the entire family. Brothers stopped speaking to each other. Sisters accused one another of greed. Every family gathering turned into another painful fight about money and power. Then one ambitious relative came forward with what he called a temporary solution. He convinced several family members that if my name slowly disappeared from family records and photographs, another child would have a much stronger legal claim to inherit everything. He claimed it would only be for a short time until the legal dispute ended. He promised that once everything was settled, the truth would quietly be restored. At first, my mother believed him. She hated the idea but thought it would only last a few months. One photograph was altered, then another. Soon birthday albums were replaced, family scrapbooks were changed, and copies of old pictures were quietly distributed. Every year, it became easier for people to pretend nothing had happened. As the years passed, the temporary lie became permanent. New generations grew up believing the altered photographs were real. Family members repeated the same false stories so many times that some even convinced themselves they were true. Anyone who questioned the missing pictures was told to stop asking difficult questions. My mother reached across the table and held my hand as she cried harder than I had ever seen before. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she whispered. But every year I waited, the truth became bigger, the lie became stronger, and I became too ashamed to admit that I had failed to protect my own son. For the first time, I understood that I hadn't simply lost family photographs. I had lost nearly 3 decades of my own history because someone believed money was worth more than the truth. After hearing my mother's confession, I wanted to believe the nightmare was finally over. I thought the altered photographs were the only lie my family had been hiding. But as I continued searching through my grandfather's box and comparing every document with the records inside our house, I realized something far more disturbing. The photographs were only the beginning. Someone hadn't just changed pictures. They had carefully rewritten almost every memory connected to my childhood. I started with old family scrapbooks. The original pages inside my grandfather's box were completely different from the ones kept inside our living room cabinet. My name had been covered with new handwriting. Entire captions had been replaced. In several places, empty spaces appeared where photographs had once been removed. It looked as though someone had spent years editing our family's history one page at a time. The next discovery shocked me even more. Inside an old folder were copies of birthday invitations from my childhood. On the original invitations, my name appeared as the birthday boy. But the copies stored inside our family albums had my name completely erased. Some even listed another child instead. It was as if my birthdays had belonged to someone else. I decided to visit my old primary school. The principal allowed me to look through archived records after I explained my work as a photo restoration specialist. As I compared old class lists with the copies my family had kept, I noticed strange differences. Some attendance records had missing pages. Group photographs displayed in the hallway showed unusual gaps where students should have been standing. Even a newspaper clipping about a school art competition had been trimmed so that my face no longer appeared, even though my name was still listed among the winners. With every discovery, the same pattern became impossible to ignore. Different people had handled different records over many years, yet all the changes pointed toward one goal: to slowly remove me from every important moment of my own life. I spread everything across my apartment floor. School records, family albums, newspaper articles, birthday invitations, hospital papers, and original photographs formed 2 separate histories. One showed the life I had actually lived. The other showed the life someone wanted the world to believe. Looking at both versions side by side felt like staring at 2 completely different families. The hardest part wasn't realizing that someone had lied. It was realizing how many people had helped keep that lie alive. Some may have acted out of fear. Others may have believed they were protecting the family. But together, they had allowed my identity to disappear piece by piece, until even I began questioning my own memories. At that moment, I finally understood the truth. My disappearance had never been an accident or a single cruel decision. It had been a carefully planned campaign carried out over decades, designed to erase my place in the family so completely that one day, nobody would even remember I had ever belonged there. That night, after hours of sorting through the old documents, I noticed one journal that looked different from all the others. Unlike the rest, it was wrapped in a clean white cloth and tied with a faded ribbon. My hands shook as I untied it. On the very first page, written in my grandmother's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For my grandson Lanla. Open this only when you begin searching for the truth." For a long moment I couldn't move. It felt as though my grandmother had known this day would come. Even though she was gone, it was almost like she was sitting beside me, finally ready to tell me everything she had been forced to keep inside for so many years. I slowly turned the pages. Every entry had a date, beginning just a few weeks after I was born. She had written down every family meeting, every argument, and every painful conversation about the inheritance dispute. She described how greed slowly changed people she had once trusted. Brothers stopped acting like brothers. Sisters stopped speaking to each other. Family dinners became silent, and every visit ended with another fight over money and property. Then I reached the pages that made my heart sink. My grandmother had carefully recorded the day the first family photograph was altered. She even wrote the names of the people who had agreed to replace it. She begged them not to do it, warning that once they started changing history, it would never stop. But nobody listened to her. They believed they were protecting the family's future. Page after page revealed more heartbreaking details. She described watching new photo albums arrive with my face missing. She wrote about secretly keeping the original photographs because she knew someone would eventually need them. Every time another memory was changed, she quietly saved another piece of evidence. She hid copies of letters, hospital records, film negatives, and family documents, knowing they might one day be the only proof left. One entry made me stop reading for several minutes. She wrote that I had once asked her why there were so few pictures of me as a child. She admitted that she smiled and changed the subject because she was too afraid to tell me the truth. She apologized in her journal, saying that keeping silent had become the greatest regret of her life. Near the end of the journal, her handwriting became weaker as her health declined. Yet her determination never faded. She wrote that she knew many people would refuse to believe me after she was gone. That was why she had spent years collecting evidence instead of simply telling stories. She understood that memories could be questioned but written proof could not. The final page brought tears to my eyes. It read, "If you are holding this journal, it means I am no longer here to protect you. But never forget this, my grandson. They may have erased your face from photographs, but they could never erase the truth. I have spent my final years protecting it for you. Now it is your turn to bring it into the light." As I closed the journal, I realized my grandmother had been fighting for me all along. Even in her final days, she refused to let the lie become the family's permanent legacy. I barely slept after finishing my grandmother's journal. Every page had answered one question but created another. There was still one thing I needed to know. Who had started all of this? Who had decided that a little boy should disappear from his own family's history? The answer came the next morning as I opened the final section of the journal. My grandmother had written one name several times, always underlined in dark ink. Sibusiso Maduna. He was my mother's older brother, the uncle who had always acted polite whenever I saw him at family gatherings. Growing up, I never thought much about him. He rarely visited, always kept conversations short, and seemed more interested in discussing business than spending time with family. I had no idea that behind his calm smile was a man who had quietly shaped my entire life. According to my grandmother's journal, everything changed when my grandfather's health began to fail. Sibusiso became obsessed with taking control of the family's businesses, properties, and investments. He believed that if fewer legal heirs could prove their place in the family, it would be much easier for him to claim a larger share of the inheritance. Instead of fighting honestly, he chose a different path. He decided to slowly erase the evidence that I had always belonged. The journal described secret meetings held behind closed doors. Sibusiso convinced several relatives that removing my name from family records would only be temporary until the inheritance dispute was settled. He promised no one would get hurt and claimed it was simply a legal strategy. Some family members believed him because they trusted him. Others stayed silent because they were afraid of causing more conflict. A few refused to help, but their voices were ignored. As the years passed, Sibusiso's plan became bigger. It was no longer just about changing a few photographs. He encouraged people to replace albums, edit scrapbooks, and ignore questions whenever anyone noticed something strange. Every successful lie made the next one easier. Slowly, the false version of our family became accepted as the real one. The most painful discovery came from one of my grandmother's final entries. She wrote that there were moments when Sibusiso could have stopped everything. More than once, relatives suggested restoring the original photographs and telling the truth before it was too late, but each time he refused. He argued that admitting the deception would destroy his position, damage his reputation, and risk his claim to the family wealth. Protecting the lie became more important to him than protecting his own family. As I finished reading, I realized something heartbreaking. What had started as simple greed had grown into nearly 30 years of manipulation. One selfish decision had forced an entire family to live inside a carefully created illusion. Children grew up believing false stories. Adults repeated lies until they sounded like facts. And I had spent my whole life wondering why I never truly felt like I belonged. For the first time, I wasn't searching for the person responsible anymore. I knew exactly who had started everything. Now the only question left was whether he would finally face the truth he had spent decades trying to bury. A few days later, I asked every surviving member of our family to come to my grandfather's old house. Some arrived confused, others looked nervous, and a few clearly believed I was causing unnecessary trouble. No one knew exactly why I had called them together. They only knew that I had found something hidden among my grandfather's belongings. As they quietly took their seats around the large dining table, the room felt heavy with tension. The same house that had once been filled with laughter now felt like a courtroom waiting for the truth. Without saying a word, I placed two photographs side by side in the center of the table. One came from the family album everyone had trusted for years. The other was the untouched original from my grandfather's hidden box. Gasps filled the room. In the altered picture, there was an empty space beside my mother. In the original, I was standing there with a bright smile holding her hand. No one could explain what they were seeing. Then I placed another pair of photographs on the table. And another. Birthday parties, Christmas celebrations, family vacations, school events. Every original picture showed me exactly where I belonged. Every altered copy showed the space where I had been carefully removed. The evidence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Next, I opened my grandmother's final journal and began reading her entries aloud. I read every dated page describing the family meetings, the inheritance arguments, the decisions to replace photographs, and her desperate attempts to stop the deception. As her words filled the room, people lowered their heads in shame. Some quietly wiped away tears. Others couldn't even look at me. One elderly aunt suddenly covered her mouth and began crying. She admitted that she had always wondered why the old albums looked different, but never asked questions because everyone else acted as though nothing was wrong. Another cousin confessed that he had grown up believing I simply wasn't present at many family events because that was the story he had always been told. Hearing the truth made him realize he had unknowingly repeated the same lie for years. Even my father finally stood up with tears in his eyes. He admitted that fear had controlled him for too long. Every time he wanted to speak, someone reminded him that exposing the truth would destroy the family forever. Instead of protecting his son, he had protected a lie. The room became completely silent when I reached my grandfather's handwritten note. I slowly read his final message, reminding everyone that the truth could be hidden but never erased. No one interrupted. No one argued. For the first time in nearly 30 years, there were no excuses left. As every original photograph remained spread across the table, the reality became impossible to deny. The lie had survived for decades because ordinary people had accepted it without asking questions. Looking around the room, I realized I wasn't watching my family fall apart. I was watching them finally see the truth that had been in front of them all along. After the family gathering ended, many people expected me to take legal action or spend the rest of my life trying to punish those who had betrayed me. I understood why they thought that. After everything I had discovered, anger would have been the easiest path to follow. But every time I looked at my grandfather's note and my grandmother's journal, I realized they had never asked me to seek revenge. They had only asked me to protect the truth. So I returned to the place where I felt strongest, my restoration studio. Every morning I unlocked the door, switched on the lights, and carefully placed another original photograph on my work table. For years I had restored strangers' memories. Now for the first time I was restoring my own. Some photographs were faded by time. Others had scratches, torn corners, or water damage. I worked patiently hour after hour, repairing every tiny detail. I carefully brought back the colors of birthday balloons, the smiles on my grandparents' faces, and the bright blue sky above our family picnics. Most importantly, I restored myself into every picture exactly as I had always been. I didn't add anything that wasn't there. I simply brought back the truth that someone else had tried to erase. As the collection grew, I noticed something unexpected happening inside me. The pain that had followed me for weeks slowly became lighter. Every restored photograph reminded me that my childhood had been real. My memories had never been false. The lies had only covered them for a while. Then an idea came to me. Instead of hiding these photographs inside another album, I decided to share them. I rented a small community art gallery and organized a public exhibition called The Missing Picture. Along one wall, I displayed the altered photographs. Beside each one, I placed the restored original. Visitors could clearly see the empty spaces in one image and the complete family in the other. People walked through the exhibition in complete silence. Many stopped for long moments, comparing each pair of photographs. Some visitors had tears in their eyes as they read short descriptions explaining how family history had been rewritten through greed and fear. Others thanked me for reminding them how powerful the truth could be. Even after many years, several of my relatives came as well. They quietly stood in front of the restored photographs, seeing our family's real history together for the first time in decades. No one argued anymore. No one tried to defend the past. The pictures spoke for themselves. As I looked around the gallery, I finally understood something that had taken me 28 years to learn. My place in this family did not depend on whether people accepted me. It never had. My place had always existed. It had simply been hidden beneath years of lies. Now every restored photograph told the complete story again, and for the first time in my life, no one could pretend I had never been there. Several months passed and life slowly became quieter. The family arguments had faded, the lies had finally been exposed, and the exhibition had helped many people understand what had really happened. But there was still one thing I knew I had to do. My grandfather had protected the original film negatives for nearly 30 years, risking everything to preserve the truth. I wanted to honor his courage in the best way I knew. One evening, after closing my studio, I carefully placed the oldest negative into my restoration scanner. It was the very first complete family portrait ever taken after I was born. The film had faded with age and tiny scratches covered parts of the image, but I worked patiently, using every skill I had learned throughout my career. Hour by hour, the picture slowly came back to life. Every smile returned. Every face became clear. Every missing detail was restored exactly as it had been on the day the photograph was taken. When the restoration was finally complete, I stared at the image for a long time without speaking. There I was, standing proudly between my parents, my grandmother smiling beside me, and my grandfather resting his hand on my shoulder. No empty spaces. No missing child. No carefully hidden lie. It was the family portrait that should have been hanging in our home all along. I printed the photograph on the finest paper I could find and placed it inside a beautiful wooden frame. A few days later, I carried it back to my grandfather's house, the place where everything had begun. With several family members quietly watching, I hung the portrait on the living room wall where everyone entering the house would see it first. No one spoke for several minutes. My mother wiped away tears as she looked at the complete family she had almost lost forever. My father stood beside her, unable to hide his emotions. Even younger relatives, who had grown up believing the altered photographs were real, smiled as they finally saw the true history of our family. As I stepped back and looked at the finished portrait, something inside me finally settled. For years, I believed my greatest loss had been the missing photographs. But I now understood that pictures were only pieces of paper. What truly mattered was refusing to let lies become someone's legacy. I smiled as I remembered my grandfather's final words. He had trusted that one day I would find the truth, and he had been right. Looking at the portrait, I realized something that changed me forever. People can crop a picture. They can hide a face. They can rewrite a story. But no matter how carefully they try to erase the past, the truth has a way of returning. Just like an old photograph waiting patiently in the dark, it always develops when the time is right. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't searching for my place in the family anymore. Everyone could finally see that I had been there all along.